Okay, I will start again. So today I would like to talk to you about Swami Abhedananda and his work in the West. And we are remembering him because, according to the lunar calendar, 3 days ago was his birthday. He spent 25 years expounding the teachings of Vedanta throughout Europe and North America. And of all the direct disciples, he was perhaps the closest to being the second Swami Vivekananda. But before we get to the topic proper, we should know something about his earlier life, because that formed a firm foundation for his future work. He was born on October 2nd in 1866 in Calcutta, and he was given the name Kali Prasad. He started nursery school at the age of 5, where he learned the alphabet, heard stories from the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, and he also memorized Sanskrit verses on morality and ethics. And at the age of 7, he studied Sanskrit literature and grammar. He was a bright student and a voracious reader, and at the age of 10, he entered the well-known high school, the Oriental Seminary, where his father taught English. Although he was more interested in developing his intellect, he did regularly do exercises. He swam in the Ganges. He attended the local gymnasium. But then he read a book by Herbert Spencer entitled Education. And the author claims that those who do vigorous exercise do so at the expense of their brains. So he stopped going to the gymnasium. And he was inspired by Shankara's life and cherished the desire to become a pundit and a philosopher. He was also taking a class in drawing at the time, and in 1 year he excelled, and the teacher praised his skill and prophesied a bright future for him. But one day Kali told the teacher that he was no longer going to attend the drawing class because he had decided to become a philosopher. The teacher tried to persuade him that it would be better to be a painter than a philosopher. But Kali rebuked, and he said, "A painter only studies the surface of things, but a philosopher goes to the depth of things." So he wanted to be a philosopher. He was extremely inquisitive, and his father being a teacher of English, he would ask his father many questions. And he would use his savings to buy books instead of refreshments. He had a remarkable memory and power of concentration. He learned how to fish, how to cook, how to fix things, do some carpentry work. And he also learned how to work in the garden and bind books. And when he was 14, he found in his father's library a copy of the Bhagavad Gita, and he started to read it. His father snatched it away from him and said, "You are too young to read this book." So when his father was out of the house, he went around looking for that book and then stole away to read it by himself. In the 1880s, being the capital of India, Calcutta was pulsating with cultural activities. Religious and political organizations were coming up. And Kali attended the lectures of the Brahmo Samaj, as well as lectures on Hindu philosophy. His desire to learn the scriptures was phenomenal. He studied the yoga aphorisms of Patanjali, Hatha Yoga, Raja Yoga, and more. And he had the desire to be absorbed in samadhi. But he was told that he would have to he would have to be properly instructed by a competent teacher. But his study of the scriptures could not quench his thirst for knowledge, so he became restless to find a guru. In the June of 1884, he went to the Dakshineshwar temple and finally met Sri Ramakrishna after much difficulty. He didn't really have directions of where to find the Dakshineshwar temple, so he kept asking people for directions, and some of them were misguided. And so the route ended up being very long and circuitous. So he got there toward the later part of the day. In his autobiography, he mentions that the master asked about me, and I told him, I have a desire to learn yoga. Will you kindly teach me? And the master kept quiet for a while and then said, that is a good sign. It is a good sign that you have a desire to learn yoga at such a young age. But then Sri Ramakrishna said that you were a yogi in your previous life. A little was left for perfection. This will be your last birth. Yes, I will teach you yoga. Come, rest tonight and come and see me again tomorrow morning. Well, the next morning, Sri Ramakrishna gave him spiritual instructions and wrote a mantra on his tongue with his middle finger, his right hand, and asked him to meditate on Kali, the Divine Mother. He described his experiences to Sri Ramakrishna, and Sri Ramakrishna was pleased and gave him further instruction. Afterwards, he left for home. But meanwhile, his parents were quite worried about him because he was gone for the night. They didn't know where he was, but then his mother remembered, oh, he must have gone to the Dakshineshwar. So she sent her husband to go to the Dakshineshwar and get their son. However, when he arrived at the Dakshineshwar, Kali had already left. And then his father spoke to Sri Ramakrishna and he said, Sir, Kali is my son. Please advise him to get married and become a householder. But Sri Ramakrishna said, but he is a great yogi. As he does not want to get married, what good would it be to force him to marry? But then his father rebuked and said, it is the supreme dharma for a son to serve his parents. But Sri Ramakrishna kept quiet. But his father felt relieved anyway and returned home. So Kali would frequently visit the master, but that irritated his father. So he locked the main door to their property, and Kali could not just leave whenever he wanted. But one day someone left that door unlocked, and Kali ran to the Dakshineshwar temple and spent that night with the master. I'm sure he got scolded when he got back home, but he continued to practice his spiritual disciplines while at home. And one day while meditating at home, he saw various gods and goddesses and divine incarnations. He saw Krishna, Christ, Chaitanya, and others merge one by one into the luminous form of Sri Ramakrishna. After this experience, he ran to the Dakshineshwar temple and told Sri Ramakrishna what he had witnessed. And to this, Ramakrishna said, you have seen Vaikuntha, the abode of Vishnu. Henceforth, you will no longer have any visions. You have risen to the formless state. And after this vision, Kali was fully convinced that the master was an avatar. And as he spent more time around the master and serving him, he became more familiar with other young devotees that were there around Sri Ramakrishna. But soon, Sri Ramakrishna was diagnosed with cancer, because Kali only met him like 2 years before he was to pass away. And so the disciples all took turns caring for him, and Kali had his designated turns. And Kali did not go back home. But then his father came to see Sri Ramakrishna and asked Kali to come home because his mother was weeping bitterly at home, wondering what had happened to her son. Well, Sri Ramakrishna immediately told Kali to go home and spend the night there at least. But when Kali went there, everybody was happy and everything. His mother stopped crying, but he left within half an hour to go back to the Dakinashar. And in his autobiography, he mentioned that he felt more at peace around Ramakrishna than he did at home, and felt that parental affection seemed more insipid compared to the Master's pure love. So in January of 1886, about 6 months before Sri Ramakrishna passed away, he distributed 12 ochre robes and rosaries amongst his young disciples, Kali being one of them. And when he was not serving the Master, Kali would meditate and study Eastern and Western philosophies. Once Ramakrishna asked him, "My boy, what are you reading?" And Kali replied, "It's an English book on logic that teaches how to make arguments about the existence of God." And then Sri Ramakrishna replied, "It is you who have introduced the habit of reading among the boys. You should know that book learning is of no value. If you want to kill yourself, a nail cutter can serve the purpose. But if you want to kill others, you need swords, shields, and other weapons. Study is necessary for that purpose. Those who will teach people are to read books." A couple of months later, during a break at the worship of Lord Shiva, Narendra, who was the future Swami Vivekananda, wanted to test his power of transmitting superconsciousness to Kali. And so Narendra sat in deep meditation. And, well, actually, before that, he asked Kali to put his hand on his knee, on Narendra's knee, while Narendra went into deep meditation. And Kali's hands started to tremble rapidly. After a few moments, Narendra opened his eyes and inquired, "How did you feel?" And Kali replied, "I felt as if a current were entering into me, just as when one holds an electric battery. One's hand trembles all the while." Well, one of his brother disciples went to inform Sri Ramakrishna what was happening. And then the Master asked Narendra to come and see him. And then Narendra went into the room and the Master said to him, "Do you understand what great harm you have done to that boy by infusing your thoughts on him? He has been following a particular line for a long time. All is spoiled now. Well, what's done is done. Never do it again." However, the boy is lucky, and Narendra was dumbfounded. And from that time onward, Kali was defending his actions through non-dualistic Vedanta. He began to argue against others' ideas about blind faith in God. And then it was reported to Ramakrishna that Kali had become an atheist. And the Master smiled. And then one night, the Master asked, "Hello, I hear you have become an atheist." And Kali kept quiet. The Master questioned him further. "Do you believe in God? Do you accept the validity of the scriptures?" "No, sir," replied Kali. To this the Master said, If you had said this to another holy man, he would have slapped your face. Sir, and then Kali says, Sir, you are free to do so. As long as I do not realize that God exists and that the Vedas are true, how can I blindly accept these things? If you kindly enlighten me and give me spiritual insight, I shall accept them all. Kali's sincerity impressed Ramakrishna, who said with delight, a day will come when you know and accept everything, but don't be one-sided. I don't care for one-sidedness. In other words, don't be just non-dual. Also, you have to accept duality. Kali was very inquisitive, as I mentioned earlier, but he was also always on the lookout for the next greatest thing, the next thing to learn or just to discover. So he became intrigued when he heard about a great Hatha yogi living near a cave, living in a cave near Gaya. And he desperately wanted to see him, and he went there without telling anyone. He took a train and he spent the night at an inn meant for pilgrims. And there he met a monk of the Dashnami Puri sect and copied into his notebook the monastic vows and mantras of the Shankar order. Well, as a side note, Totapuri, who was initiated by Sri Ramakrishna into monastic life, who was initiated into, oh right, thank you. So Totapuri initiated Sri Ramakrishna into monastic life. No, yes, that's true.
That's right.
And he was also of this order. And as these vows and mantras are used by the Ramakrishna order, we are thus all monks of the Ramakrishna order, Dashnami Puri sect. Well, the next morning, Kali proceeded toward the Hatha Yogi's cave, but he was warned ahead of time that it would be very difficult because they discourage visitors. So Kali decided to go towards the cave by a less common route. And when the yogi's disciples discovered him, they were about to attack him because he caught them unawares. But he bowed down to them in his ochre robe, so they realized, oh, he must be a monk. So they questioned him and learned that he knew the sannyasa mantras. Well, and so they accepted him. Now Kali started to inquire of that Hatha yogi about his teachings and so forth. But in the course of the questioning, he realized, no, this yogi is not as advanced as he was informed that he might be. So he asked to leave. But the yogi would not let him leave. Because they felt, no, they have secrets and they have things that they want to keep within their group. So he did not give Kali permission to leave. So and at that time, Sri Ramakrishna appeared in his mind, and he realized that he had made a great mistake by coming to this yogi. So he decided to run away. But he couldn't just leave, he had to fake that he was going to get water outside. And when he did that, he just ran down the hill, and the yogi's disciples were throwing stones at him and so forth. And that's when Kali realized that the greatness of Sri Ramakrishna. So Sri Ramakrishna passed away on the 16th of August in 1886. And soon after, the young man moved into a dilapidated building that became the first monastery. And they called it Baranagar Mat. It was a life of poverty and hardship, but Kali spent his time in meditation, studying the scriptures, and composing Sanskrit hymns on Sri Ramakrishna and Holy Mother. After reading one of the hymns to the Holy Mother, she blessed him, saying, "May Saraswati, the goddess of learning, sit on your lips." And when someone at the Baranagar monastery complained that Kali wasn't taking responsibility for household work, Narendra said, "Let one of the brothers be a scholar, and I'll do the dishes myself." As I mentioned earlier, Kali was well versed in both Eastern and Western philosophies, and he enjoyed having discussions and debates with Narendra. Usually Narendra could silence him, but one day Kali cornered him in an argument so well that Narendra could not give a reply. So Narendra just said, "Well, let's stop here today and resume from this place tomorrow." And then the next day, and Kali was very happy because he thought he had defeated Narendra. But then the next day, Narendra began giving new arguments that refuted all of Kali's points. And Kali had to admit defeat. And then one day, Narendra proposed that they all take the vows of sannyasa according to the scriptural injunctions, and everyone agreed. And when Kali told them that he had a copy of the Viraja Homa mantras, which are the mantras that are chanted in front of a sacred fire, which he had gotten from a monk in Gaya, his brothers were excited. And during that ceremony, Narendra gave Kali the name Swami Abhedananda. And from 1887 through 1893, Swami Abhedananda traveled throughout India, mostly on foot, meeting scholars, pundits, yogis, and other swamis. He had discussions with them, and he also taught them. But he always continued with his studies. He was like a consummate student. In 1893, when Swami Vivekananda successfully represented Hinduism at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago, he became internationally well known. While Christian missionaries and, at that time, the Brahmo Samaj leader, Pratap Chandra Mazumdar, expressed their jealousy by slandering Swami Vivekananda. They told the American people that Swamiji was not a true representative of Hinduism. Well, when his brother monks heard about that back in India, Swami Abhedananda took charge and, along with his other brother monks, arranged a large public meeting attended by important dignitaries. And during that meeting, they passed resolutions stating that Swami Vivekananda was indeed a fit representative of Hinduism at the World Parliament of Religions, and they submitted copies to Swamiji and to the arrangers of the Parliament. In July of 1896, Swami Vivekananda requested that Abhedananda join him in London. He arrived in September 1896, but suffered from seasickness and lack of vegetarian food while aboard ship. They were overjoyed to see each other after so many years. Swamiji arranged to buy him new clothes and showed him around London and introduced him to all his friends and devotees. And so began Abhedananda's work in the West. Well, gradually he became acquainted with life outside of India, and a month after his arrival, Swami Vivekananda proudly announced that Swami Abhedananda will speak on Hinduism. And at first he was quite nervous and reluctant to speak, but Swamiji encouraged him to depend on the Master. And so he gave his first maiden speech to a learned audience of the Crystal Theosophical Society in London. Vivekananda was so pleased that he said, "Even if I perish on this earthly plane, my message will be sounded through those dear lips, and the world will hear it. Vivekananda had full confidence in Abhedananda that he would be able to carry out the Vedanta work in London during his absence. So he entrusted him with his classes on Vedanta and Raja Yoga. And Swamiji left for India in December of 1886. For 1 year, Abhedananda continued to give classes and lectures in different churches, religious and philosophical societies in London and its suburbs. And during his stay in London, he became acquainted with many distinguished savants, including Max Muller, Paul Deussen, and they all described that his eloquence, his lucid exposition of Vedanta philosophy, and his depth of spiritual realization made a profound impression on his audiences. But Swamiji soon asked Abhedananda to carry on the Vedanta work in the United States. And so on July 31st of 1897, Swami Abhedananda left for New York, and he arrived there 9 days later. He was the guest of the secretary of the Vedanta Society of New York, founded by Swami Vivekananda in 1894. And in addition to New York, he gave talks in cities along the East Coast. He also met the inventor Thomas Edison and visited his laboratory, and they talked about Vedanta and India. Abhedananda's first lecture series in New York City was on the topic, "What is Vedanta?" And that inspired a young Western man who later became Swami Atulananda to join the order. And he later wrote the book, With the Swamis in America. So the Society's activities consisted of lectures and classes, spiritual instruction and interviews at the center and in the homes where Abhedananda visited were carried on for 20 years under Abhedananda's direction. And a publication department was organized, and the Swami worked very hard, slept very little, as he spent his time writing books at night. The proceeds from those books helped make the center self-sufficient. But as his popularity grew in New York, Christian missionaries were fabricating scandalous stories about his character. But undaunted, he paid no heed and continued to work with his usual vigor and composure. But he would at times relate stories to his devotees about all the suffering, racism, all the people trying to go against and prevent the spread of Vedanta during those years, and would always encourage them to depend on the Master, always depend on the Master. But during this work, he also met many famous scientists and even the President of the United States. He met President McKinley in May of 1898. He was cordially received by the President, and the President inquired about the Vedanta movement in the US and the British rule of India. He also had met and had many long discussions with several famous intellectuals and professors. He gave talks at universities, and in those days, there was not much entertainment in the form of TV and so forth, but a lot of lectures. A lot of people attending lectures. And so organizations were always trying to get speakers to come and talk. So many of these were arranged, and he would go to present the ideas of Vedanta to these groups. But he was so busy preaching and teaching that he was neglecting his own health and soon became sick. When the Holy Mother learned about this, she advised him to avoid the vegetarian diet and at least start eating fish, and to avoid some of his severe austerities. So he recovered after about a month and then resumed his preaching. Swami Vivekananda made a second visit to America in 1899. And during that time, the Vedanta Society of New York became a legally registered organization. But the society had moved several times. In fact, from the time it originally was founded by Swami Vivekananda to its present location, it moved 10 times. So, and at this time when Swami Vivekananda was there, they finally had a house of their own, but it was still a rented house. But now that it had become a registered organization, it became more well-known, and from 1901 onwards, his audiences were increasing to 600. And the number of students in his yoga class increased so much that he had to give classes twice a day. And to accommodate overflowing audiences, the society had to rent the Carnegie Lyceum for his lectures. Well, on June 22nd of the year 1901, Swami Abhedananda finally headed out west to San Francisco. After making several stops along the way, he actually arrived in Seattle on the 25th of July. There's even a short paragraph in the Seattle Daily Times dated July 26, 1901 that states, under the heading, East Indian Scholar, Swami Abhedananda, an East Indian scholar and professor of Indian philosophy, who has been 4 years in New York, arrived in the city from the East last evening on a pleasure trip over the country and is a guest of the Rainier Grand. The Rainier Grand is a large hotel, at that time located on First Avenue in downtown Seattle. But you won't find it today if you're thinking of going there for a pilgrimage, because it was torn down in 1930 and replaced with a federal building. I could not find any record indicating whether Swami Abhedananda gave talks here or whom he met, but based on the timeline, he arrived in San Francisco less than 3 days later. So given the time it takes to travel by train, he did not stay in Seattle very long. In fact, the first known Vedanta talks didn't come to Seattle, Tacoma, or Everett until 1914 by Swami Prakashananda. So the talks that Swami Abhedananda gave in San Francisco and Los Angeles were all well received. But he was like the consummate, not just a consummate student, he was a consummate traveler, always in motion. And so even on his way back to New York, he was giving talks. And when he got back to New York, he continued lecture tours throughout the US, Canada, Mexico, and Europe. But in 1906, he decided to visit India for 6 months. But when he returned to New York in 1907, he continued preaching. And during his long absence, he left Swamis Paramananda and Bodhananda in charge of the New York Society. And both of those Swamis have come to Seattle since Swami Prakashananda. So Swami Abhedananda, he finally left America in July of 1921 from San Francisco. But on his way to returning to India, he also stopped in Honolulu, Japan, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Manila, and Singapore, and spent time in those places, learning the culture giving teachings in Vedanta. So Abhedananda had gathered tremendous experience while traveling and lecturing extensively in Europe and America for 25 years. Since his arrival in the West in 1896, he has crossed the Atlantic Ocean 17 times and had carried the message of Vedanta to innumerable people. His writings also had made a tremendous impact on the Western mind. On the eve of his departure from San Francisco, he said, "The East and the West will unite. Such is God's will. The signs of the times greatly encourage me. And my visit and prolonged stay in this country have clearly convinced me that it is possible to make the world our home and to love all our brothers and sisters. God's Spirit is working everywhere. Blessed is he who sees the work and realizes the divine Spirit." But when he got back to India, he continued to do his work until he passed away on September 8th, 1939. So there is no doubt that the Swami's extensive travels brought Vedanta to the Western audience and inspired the growth of today's Vedanta societies. But many of you today who discovered Vedanta in recent years may not be aware of how indebted you are to him. He kept the Vedanta Society of New York alive and growing for 20 years, spreading Vedanta around the world. The same Vedanta Society, presently headed by Swami Abhedananda, who may not be traveling as much as Swami Abhedananda did, but the words of Vedanta are spreading throughout the internet. And so those YouTube talks are still inspiring are still inspiring the current generation of spiritual seekers. So thank you very much. I will conclude with a chant and give some announcements. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramayaha, Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu, Makaschit Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. May all be happy. May all be free from disease. May all realize what is good. May none be subject to misery. Om, peace, peace, peace to all beings. This Wednesday, well, as I mentioned, Swami Satyamananda returns this Tuesday. This Wednesday is a Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class that will take place here and also online. On Thursday, Swami Brahmatmananda continues with the class Towards the Goal Supreme. That is held online via Google Meet. And Swami Satyamananda will continue with the topic Ramakrishna's Miracle on Gaurima, Part 3, this Friday. And next Sunday, he will give the talk, The Significance of the Worship of Durga. So thank you all very much for attending.